Helen was desperately bored in her marriage. Gregory was good, kind, intelligent, a wonderful father and a caring husband, but Helen was always missing something. She was annoyed by Gregory's overprotectiveness. He looked in her eyes as if he wasn't even a man. No matter how hard Gregory tried, Helen didn't appreciate his efforts, and it was all for nothing. They had been married 7 years ago, when Helen had been 22. A girl in love, dizzy from the words Gregory said to her. The guy knew how to court. He gave her flowers, wrote her poems, and did other nice surprises that another man would hardly think he should do even for the woman he loved. Helen did not immediately realize what happened in their relationship with her husband. Gregory suddenly began to annoy her with his good treatment of her. But was it possible to be annoyed by such a thing? Usually they were annoyed by rudeness, and lack of attention. But here there was plenty of attention, and rudeness didn't even smell. I'm already thinking that I'm wrong. Helen shared her worries with her friend. Gregory is ready to go to pieces to make me feel good, and it just pisses me off. Listen, Helen's friend said thoughtfully, don't you think that you just fell out of love with him? What kind of nonsense is that? Helen snorted and thought for a moment. Really, what if I did? There were feelings, but it had been 7 years. It couldn't be the same as it had been in the beginning. And Helen began to think more and more often that she no longer loved her husband and did not want to be near a man she did not love. Gregory, meanwhile, suspected nothing and continued to try to be a model family man. He had time to work, take care of the baby, and cook. Helen looked at her husband and thought that despite all his perfection, she was burned out. There was nothing else inside, just emptiness. Lives next to a man to whom she feels nothing else, raises a daughter with him, shares the same bed with him. On weekends they go out of town together to a large hypermarket. But everything happens somehow banal, on the beaten path, as if nothing else, more vivid and interesting, in life cannot be. Helen was bored and thought that nothing would ever change for the better again. She was desperately bored. She did not want to see her husband, and every now and then she found reasons not to go to bed with Gregory. She had a headache, or she was annoyed by his snoring, or it would be better for her to sleep in her daughter's room. Gregory was worried, wanted more intimacy with his wife, but his actions only further irritated Helen. She didn't like the flowers he brought, or the food he cooked, or the gifts he gave her for no particular reason. All in all, Helen was ready for a divorce. That's when Arthur came into her life. He appeared by chance, just came to work with Helen, bringing some documents from the contractor. At first Helen thought that it was a courier, and then she realized that Arthur, a deputy director of a large metal depot, which is engaged in the manufacture of metal structures for almost all construction projects in the city. Helen herself temporarily sat in the reception area of the director, and in the rest of the time managed to conduct personnel work and even do accounting. Their company was engaged in the construction of small country houses. The office was constantly in flux, but Helen, well proven in the eyes of the bosses, worked in the company for more than 3 years. Mike, what a great staff you have, remarked Arthur, coming out of the director's office and paying attention to Helen. The young woman blushed slightly, just enough to show a modest embarrassment. Yes, Helen is in good standing with us, the director said, but don't look at my staff. Arthur, I won't give my people to anyone. What are you? What are you? Arthur laughed, and then asked, can I at least invite your staff to dinner? Helen blushed a little more. She was offended that the men were discussing her as if she wasn't even here. But she'd liked Arthur as soon as she'd seen him, so she wasn't going to refuse his invitation. For dinner, Mike looked at his assistant. So, Helen, are you ready to have dinner with our partner? Actually, I'm married, she said for some reason, and then bit her tongue when she saw the look of disappointment on Arthur's face. At first, she thought that the man would change his mind and take back his words. But Arthur, apparently, was not embarrassed by the marital status of the woman he liked. On Saturday, Helen went to dinner with Arthur, telling Gregory that she was dating her classmates. The husband, accustomed to trusting his wife, asked no unnecessary questions. Helen was happy. Inside she had some sweet anticipation of something wonderful that was going to happen between her and Arthur. In the restaurant she smiled, joked and tried in every possible way to please the man even more. Arthur kept his eyes on her, and Helen was glad that she was experiencing long-forgotten feelings and emotions again. It was as if she was back 8 years ago, when they had first met Gregory, and she was comfortable with the atmosphere of romance and flirtation. When the waiter approached their table, Helen didn't even pay attention to him. Helen. A voice made her look up and realize that it wasn't a guy serving them, but a girl. That girl was Helen's sister's own sister. Hello, Elizabeth, Helen replied and felt awkward. Her younger sister was well aware that Helen was married, she knew Gregory well, and here she was meeting her older sister in a restaurant with another man. I've brought the menu, Elizabeth said and put the folders in front of the guests. You can choose from the menu, and when you're ready to order, call me. How long have you worked here? Helen asked. I thought you were in school. I'm both studying and working, Elizabeth replied evasively. Anyway, take your pick for now, all of our food is delicious and served fresh. There are no preparations, the cooks cook while the guests are waiting for their order. Thank you, girl, Gregory replied. We'll call you. Helen snickered. She had never expected to see her sister in the restaurant. Of course, it was unlikely that Elizabeth would immediately report to Gregory that she had seen her older sister in the restaurant in the company of a stranger. But still the whole situation looked double and ugly. Excuse me, Arthur, I need a moment alone with my sister, Helen said, getting up from the table. Would you mind? We haven't seen each other in months. If only for a minute, Arthur replied with a smile. Helen walked over to her sister, who was standing at the bar. Why did you decide to become a waitress? Helen, what are you getting so worked up about? I needed a part-time job, and I found one. What's the problem? Elizabeth looked at her sister calmly and acted exactly the same. Helen, on the other hand, was nervous and couldn't help herself. You should have at least told me you were working now, and you should visit your mother more often, and me too. Then you'll know about all the changes in your family's life. I'm sorry, but I have my own family. Helen was indignant. I can't do both my own things and your things. Well, then don't complain. Or did you get excited because I caught you with another man? Helen was furious. This girl, who was 8 years younger than her, was allowing herself too much. A 20-year-old impudent girl who poked her nose into other people's business, and she was so happy to do it. A smile, more like a satisfied smirk, roamed across Elizabeth's face. It's not what you might think, Helen said, barely able to contain her anger and resentment. We're just talking business. Of course, we are. Elizabeth snorted. I see you both as business partners. That's it. I'm out of your business. Go and order some food, because your husband's waiting. The evening was almost ruined, so Helen ate the food without much appetite. And then she referred to feeling unwell and asked to be taken home. The whole time she and Arthur were in the restaurant, she kept catching her sister's gaze. Elizabeth was literally searing Helen with her gaze, and there was no joy or kindness in it. On the way home, Helen wondered at the exact moment when her relationship with her younger sister had soured so badly. There had never been much mental intimacy between them, but Helen had never expected such outright self-loathing at all. It was as if her sister was angry with her, but why and when exactly this transformation happened, Helen did not understand. You're so thoughtful, Arthur said gently and took Helen's hand in his. She shuddered and squeezed his hand in return, feeling the strength of a man, a real man, the kind of man who could make her happy, and make her believe in real feelings between a man and a woman again. I'm sorry, seeing my sister threw me off my game, Helen replied, but she was suddenly angry. Why would she want to spoil her mood, just because Elizabeth had behaved unkindly toward her older sister? Arthur had nothing to do with it, and Elizabeth had no business poking her nose into Helen's private life. Let's go to the country next weekend, Arthur suddenly suggested. Let's rent a house by the river, go fishing, and drink delicious wine. From Arthur's proposal, Helen became so warm at heart that immediately wanted to agree, and, without going home, immediately go out of town with this man. But her husband and daughter were waiting for her at home, and she couldn't just disappear from their lives without warning even for a weekend. And she wanted it so desperately. Thank you for the offer, Arthur, she said in a guilty voice. But you realize I'm not free. What will I say at home? Think of something, he said, and squeezed her hand again with such force that Helen felt a little hurt. She wanted so badly to spend more time with Arthur, but what could she lie to Gregory about? A weekend get-together with her friends or a trip out of town for work? Maybe make up a dressage trip to a construction site. It was so tempting to go out of town with Arthur, spend time with him, and then spend the whole night. But there were so many buts. How did it go? Gregory asked from the doorway, and Helen was angry again when she saw him. What did he care how it went? Another man would have been doing his own thing, playing computer games, watching TV, socializing with friends, but this one was just playing the role of the perfect man, which made her sick. It went well, Helen replied briefly. Gregory, can I take a shower and go to bed? As if you were already asleep. Her husband looked at Helen in surprise, but didn't object. She took a shower, rubbed herself with a sponge, rinsed everything off with hot water, and then rubbed and rubbed again, as if she wanted to peel off her skin. When she went to bed, she knew her husband was awake. "Shall we go out of town tomorrow?" Gregory suggested softly, and Helen felt uneasy. Where did such a suggestion come from? They hadn't been out in ages, and now all of a sudden it was like this. It was as if Gregory had heard the conversation between Helen and Arthur a few hours ago. "Where are we going, Gregory?" Helen asked her husband in a tired voice. "Let's get a good night's sleep, and then we'll go for a walk with our daughter. We could go to the zoo. We promised her a long time ago." "Whatever you say, sweetheart," Gregory murmured, and then pulled his wife to him. Helen pulled away from her husband. "I don't want to, Gregory. I'm tired." And he didn't insist. He lay beside her, breathing quietly into Helen's back. And she wanted to jump out of bed and run away from this room and this apartment. To run not away, but to Arthur, to fall into his arms and never part with him again. The man had not even kissed Helen, and she could already feel how strong was the mutual interest and attraction to each other. All through the work week, Helen had been looking for excuses for her husband to get away for the weekend with Arthur. He called only once to ask if everything was all right, and Helen promised to do everything she could to go with him to the much-coveted country house and spend an unforgettable time there. On Friday, when Helen was ready to talk to Gregory and warn him that she would go to the cottage on Saturday to help her mother, her husband interrupted her plans. "Olivia called me," Gregory informed her. "We're going to the cottage tomorrow." Just like that, with such simple ease, all of Helen's plans were disrupted. Olivia, Helen's mother, personally called her son-in-law and invited him to the cottage. When was that ever seen before? Helen's mother had called Gregory only about 5 times during the whole time Helen and Gregory had been living together, and now she had invited him. Helen could not find anything to say because it was a trip to her mother's country house that she had saved as a reason for fleeing the house. She would have to give up her trip to the country with Arthur and go to the garden with her family. Gregory was enthusiastic, having prepared the tools from the evening before, stuffed 2 bags of fertilizer and some buckets into the trunk. Helen watched with indifference as her husband busily made his way to his mother-in-law's house, but she was so anxious to get away. "Oh, what people." Olivia joyfully greeted her eldest daughter with her husband and granddaughter at the gate of the cottage. Helen hugged her mother, whom she hadn't seen for months, and then noticed her younger sister digging in the ground. Elizabeth nodded indifferently to Helen, waved to Gregory, and then continued her work. When all was done, they sat down to tea. Helen kept catching glances from her sister to her mother, as if they wanted to say something or ask something, but didn't dare to do so. "Are you staying the night?" Olivia asked. "No, we're going home," Helen answered. "I want to sleep in a normal environment, not be bitten by mosquitoes. I'd like to stay here." Gregory sighed. "The countryside, nature, romance. So, you stay," Elizabeth said, and Helen looked at her younger sister in amazement. "Let Helen drive herself home. She has a license." "No, I can't do that," Gregory replied. "I won't be without a family." Elizabeth grinned wryly, and Helen was ready to glare at her sister. The little wretch. And who gave her the right to open her mouth? On the way back, Helen felt the fire of contradiction growing stronger and stronger inside her. She didn't want to be with her husband, so why hadn't she persuaded him to stay at the cottage? Gregory would not have resisted her offer, would have spent the night at the cottage, and been happy that he had pleased his wife. And Helen would get in the car and drive to the cottage where Arthur was vacationing. Shit. What bad luck. "I'm hungry," whimpered her daughter in the back seat. "We ate at the cottage," Helen replied, annoyed. "Let's stop at a cafe," Gregory suggested. "Gregory, let's drive home and eat there," Helen said irritably, but her daughter whimpered again. They had to stop at a cafe, and Helen at first wanted to stay in the car, but then went with her husband and daughter. Once inside, she didn't immediately realize what was going on. There was a crowd of people sitting at one table, most of them dressed in black. Helen didn't immediately realize that they were in a memorial cafe, and at that moment some group of people were participating in a wake. "Where have you dragged us to?" Helen hissed and flew out into the street. She barely caught her breath, and then she burst into tears. Gregory, who came out after his wife, began to apologize to his wife, but Helen could not hear him. "What an idiot you are," she shouted. "How you piss me off. You annoy me. I don't want to see you." Helen screamed, ignoring her crying daughter, so disgusted with her husband and the fact that she was still with him. Helen didn't listen to Gregory's excuses. She hitched a ride and got into the car and dialed Arthur's number. Half an hour later, she was already at the cabin where Arthur himself was. He was alone, and he was very glad to see Helen. That night they spent together, and Helen had no doubt that she had made the right choice. "Will you leave your husband?" Arthur asked. "I should have done it a long time ago," Helen said. She returned home on Sunday evening. Gregory was the only one home. "Gregory, I'm leaving you for someone else," Helen said calmly. "I can't live with you anymore. I can't be with you anymore. We are strangers and I don't love you anymore." Gregory did not persuade his wife because he loved her too much. "Let it be as you say," was all he could reply. "The main thing is that you should be happy." Helen left. Arthur rented for her and her daughter a small one-room apartment, and himself solved the issue of selling the apartment left after the divorce from his first wife. Her daughter missed her father desperately, and Gregory saw her only on weekends. Helen continued working, dating Arthur and living her long-awaited free life. "I've made it," Helen thought happily every time Arthur was near her. She was in love. She liked everything about Arthur. He seemed to her the perfect man, just as Gregory had seemed to her long ago. They were divorced quickly enough, though, through the courts. Gregory had no claim to their shared apartment, and through the court received the right to communicate with his daughter. Helen, from a one-bedroom, returned to their old apartment, by which time Arthur had resolved issues with his housing, and they together, realizing all available real estate, bought a shared two-bedroom apartment with excellent repair and 2 bathrooms. Soon they were married, and it soon became clear that Helen was expecting a child. She was happy, loved her Arthur. Together they raised a daughter, Pauline. See, her ex-husband had to see now not often, but Helen, and did not want to communicate with Gregory. Everything began to change after the birth of a son. Arthur suddenly became late at work, did not pay attention to the child, and Helen felt deceived and abandoned. She was increasingly sad. She cried a lot and blamed herself for not being able to keep her husband's attention for long. After childbirth, she had gained weight, and apparently, for this reason, Arthur lost any interest in his wife. One day Helen received a call from her mother. "You should at least come to visit with Paul," Olivia said. "I've only seen my grandson twice, and he'll be a year old soon." "Mom, you can come," Helen said tiredly. "I'm running around like a squirrel, and I don't have time to visit. It's just that Elizabeth is going to introduce me to her fiancé. You should come to dinner with Paul and Pauline. Maybe Arthur would like to come, too." "Arthur's definitely not coming," Helen answered quickly, and Helen was afraid she'd been too hasty. Helen agreed. It was curious to see Elizabeth's young man. Not once in her entire life had Elizabeth ever introduced her boyfriends to her family. Sure, the girl had dated someone, but this formal, with a real dinner at her mother's house, it was the first time. Helen had arrived much earlier because she wanted to take a bath at her mother's and wash her hair properly. With a 10-month-old baby in her arms, this was not easy to do, so Helen took advantage of her mother's hospitality. When she came out of the bathroom, the doorbell was already ringing. "Shit, I'm like this." Helen cursed and ran to her mother's room to clean herself up. She quickly dried her hair, put on a dress, went out into the living room, and stunned. Sitting on the couch next to Elizabeth was Gregory. He was holding his sister Helen's hand and looked quite happy. "Meet Helen," Elizabeth said cheerfully. "This is my fiancé. I think you already know his name. Do you?" Olivia stood nearby, holding her grandson in her arms and looking confused. She clearly hadn't expected to see her former son-in-law as a guest, and even as the future husband of her youngest daughter. Elizabeth had long ago seen all the good things in Gregory that Helen herself had not seen for a long time. What one didn't see and appreciate, the other gladly accepted and appreciated. A sibling. Helen stood in the middle of the room as if stunned by an explosion. Pauline was already sitting in her father's arms, and Gregory was stroking his daughter's head and smiling at her. Then he smiled at Elizabeth, and Helen saw that look. The same look that her ex-husband had once looked at her with. The look that Arthur had never looked at her with. And it was unlikely anyone would ever look at her again. She would no longer have a husband like this man who had once been willing to do anything. Now this man was willing to do anything for another. Helen had lost everything, and it was impossible to get her happiness back.